Hi, everybody. We're going to get started now. Please, at the back, if everyone could take their seats, we're just about to start. Um, can we have the slides? Hi, my name is Isha, and I am Hands Off Mother Earth's Marine Working Group Coordinator. And thanks for being with us here today, and thanks for our panelists for joining us. And I also want to give a shout out to Hands Off Mother Earth and Friends of the Earth for sponsoring this event. And let's take it away. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. So first, we're going to hear from Sue Sayre, who's joining us online. You'll see them in a minute. She's the founder and director of the Cornwall Seal Group Research Trust. And then we're going to hear from Serena Wilson. She is an independent filmmaker and is the founder of Keep Our Seas Chemical Free. And then we're going to hear from Akalok Blatchford, who's the Geoengineering Outreach Coordinator at the Indigenous Environment Network. And then we'll hear from Ben, the Senior Campaigner for Climate, Energy, and Oceans team at Friends of the Earth US. And then lastly, we'll hear from Lily Fewer. She's the Climate and Energy Deputy Director at the Center for International Environmental Law. So today I'm going to get started by introducing marine geoengineering in general to everybody. We can divide marine geoengineering into marine carbon dioxide removal and marine solar radiation modification. But for the purpose of this talk, we're going to focus on marine carbon dioxide removal. And within marine solar radiation modification, we are going to focus on the ice-based technologies. So marine carbon dioxide removal refers to approaches that use the ocean to take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it for long periods of time. These methods aim to enhance natural processes such as phytoplankton growth, seaweed cultivation, or changes in ocean chemistry. And right now they are being explored as potential tools to help slow down climate change. And most of them are in their experimental stage right now. The first technology that I'm going to talk about is ocean fertilization. This is a method in which iron or other nutrients are added to parts of the ocean to stimulate plant growth. The idea is by fertilizing ocean regions which have lower biological productivity, minute plants called phytoplankton will grow in number, and as they multiply, they can absorb more carbon from the atmosphere and then eventually sink to the bottom of the ocean. Sorry, lagging on my slides. Another technology that I'm going to talk about is macroalgae cultivation and sinking. Seaweed or macroalgae absorbs carbon dioxide through photosynthesis and stores the carbon in its biomass. So one proposed method for carbon sequestration involves collecting and compressing seaweed biomass and then submerging it to the bottom of the ocean where the carbon can be stored. Similarly, we have biomass sinking. It's a similar technology to seaweed sinking, but instead of seaweed, you'd use terrestrial material like grasses, softwoods, hardwoods, agricultural byproducts like husk, corn husk, and sugarcane husk. And then the last technology under MCDR that I'm going to talk about is ocean alkalinity enrichment. This method involves attempting to increase the ocean's alkalinity to enable it to draw more carbon from the atmosphere. And there are two primary ways in which this can be achieved. One is by adding alkaline rocks, and the other one is by using an electrochemical method. So if we were to use alkaline rocks, finely ground alkaline material like limestone or olivine would be added to the ocean, and as they dissolve, they would act a bit like adding antacid to water, so that would neutralize the acidity and let more carbon be absorbed by the ocean. But I just want to mention that in order to do this at scale, large amount of rocks would be needed to mined and processed on land. And within the electrochemical approaches, seawater is passed through an electrochemical system that is fueled by electricity. And then the water that is pumped into these systems are made alkaline and then pushed back out into the ocean. So the idea is more alkaline water, more carbon absorption. And now I'm going to move on to talking about the ice-based technologies. The goal here is basically to reflect more sunlight back into space by enhancing the albedo to the extent in which the sunlight is reflected from a surface. There are a number of technologies, and they can span from growing crops that can reflect more light, clearing forests in snow-covered areas, and also adding reflective material to ice in order to reflect back more sunlight. So the first one that I'm only going to talk about two. The first one that is proposed to being used is adding hollow glass microspheres, which are tiny hollow balls made from silicon dioxide. So the idea is that they would be spread out on a surface, on an ice-covered surface, in order to reflect back more sunlight. And these silicon dioxide microspheres are already produced commercially, and they're usually between the size of 10 to 200 micrometers. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the concept of Arctic ice management. In this proposal, the goal is to basically thicken the ice sheet, and they use a pump to basically push out water to the surface of ice in order to thicken the surface of the ice. And this is just a broad overview of the different technologies. And I will hand it over to Sue, who's going to be joining, Sanara, who's going to be joining us online. And she is going to talk about how they approached one of these experiments that they encountered.
Hello, thanks for having me. Hope you can all hear me okay. I'm Sanara and I live in a small coastal town called St Ives. It's in the county of Cornwall, which is in the far southwest of the UK. And it's an absolutely beautiful place surrounded by sea and nature. And I want to outline what happened when a geoengineering project suddenly crash landed as if from space into St Ives Bay. And I'll talk about the shifting power dynamic that played out in the following 2 years. So what happened? In February 2023, a national newspaper broke the story that a Canadian company called Planetary Technologies, PT for short, had, as the journalist phrased it, dumped chemicals, namely magnesium hydroxide, into St Ives Bay. And they were about to do it again, all in the name of the climate crisis. For our local community, the story of those early weeks was one of confusion and a sense of powerlessness. No one knew what was happening or who to ask. What was this company? Who had given them permission? Was it safe for the marine ecosystem? When was the next test? And why had no one told us about the first one? But at this point, there was only one story in town. Planetary Technologies, PT, materialized with a fully formed narrative, and their story was a great one. They were healing the ocean and combating climate change. Their science was excellent and their safety protocols second to none. They had a glossy website with beautiful photos of ocean life and rich backers like Elon Musk. And they were promising incredible results. They were planning to remove 1 billion tons of carbon annually by 2035. The climate emergency meant there was no time for hesitation or excessive caution. The next test in St Ives Bay, our bay, was about to happen, and then they would scale up. It was all very exciting. How could we challenge this? PT had the narrative, the confidence and the momentum, and we were only just catching up. Most of us had never heard of words like geoengineering, marine carbon dioxide removal, or ocean alkalinity enhancement, which is what they were doing. And our only source of information was PT's website. Sharing our knowledge turned out to be the first subtle shift in power. PT hosted a couple of public meetings, basically to educate us into agreeing with them. They certainly weren't consultations. And having attended one of them, a local environmentalist set up an email group, later called the Cornwall Carbon Scrutiny Group. It consisted of local environmentalists, scientists, and people living around the Bay, and it grew to include scientists and experts from around the UK. She asked us all to keep notes of what was said in meetings and to share answers we received in person or online. And we also discussed developments and shared research. It meant we could keep track of all the inconsistencies in what PT was telling us and also begin to see the worrying gaps in their knowledge. The second shift in power came when our community made itself visible and we began to tell our own story. We now had more knowledge and a better understanding of what was happening, but it seemed there was nothing we could do to stop the next test. PT insisted they already had all the necessary permissions. This is when we decided to hold a protest. We formed a community group, Keep Our Sea Chemical Free, to organise it. Not everyone in the email group thought this was a good idea. For some, it seemed too oppositional. But for the people most intimately connected to St Ives Bay, those who lived around it and are in it often every day, it felt deeply necessary. We needed to reclaim our connection to the Bay and to express our shock and outrage at the lack of oversight or consultation. Our first protest was held in the dunes overlooking the Bay, and hundreds of people turned out. Through this act, we were able to assert not only our physical connection to the Bay, but also our emotional and spiritual ties. After the speeches, over 50 surfers paddled out to form a huge circle in the ocean, while supporters looked on from the beach. The protest had a very significant impact. The first shift was in ourselves. My young friend Ollie said he would never forget the day. It gave him so much hope. And this shift in our sense of what we could achieve together is probably the most important thing that happened as a result of the protest. The second shift was in our visibility. Our opposition to what PT was doing now had physical shape. We had compelling photographs and stories in the local and national press. We had spokespeople, organisations, a social media presence. And the third shift was our own story coming into focus. We now had a counter-narrative. It was a story of local people with a huge amount of knowledge about their environment and a desire to protect it. We weren't screaming no. We were asking for an environmental impact assessment and for a proper consultation. The fourth shift was in our connections. Ripples spread out from news of the protest, and we started being contacted by journalists and scientists from around the world, and also by NGOs who could help us, and a massive shout out to Hands Off Mother Earth here. We began to realise that what was happening in St Ives had much broader implications. By now, we'd worked out that this was the first open sea testing of ocean alkalinity enhancement anywhere in the world. So this was totally new for our marine ecosystem, but also for us. We were the human guinea pigs, a test case of how communities might react to such projects. The rest of our story is a tangle of competing narratives. PT were desperate to keep their show on the road. I think they couldn't understand why we would oppose such a small test. But we knew that we had to hold the line and insist on the best possible safeguards and science, because if we let this test happen, PT would regain the momentum and the narrative. Sue Sayer, my brilliant colleague, who I met at that first protest and plan to keep as a friend forever, will tell you about what happened when we finally got PT to talk with scientists who could hold them to account in real time. Meanwhile, we held another joyful and colourful protest with a mass swim in the sea and a fleet of fishing and working boats, this time targeting South West Water, one of the worst polluting water companies in the UK, who had partnered with PT. And then suddenly, it was all over. almost 2 years after we'd first heard of planetary technologies, in a ridiculous and sort of hilarious signal gate of their own, we found out and broke the news that PT were pulling out. This was the moment that all power finally slipped away from PT's narrative about their place in Cornwall. This didn't spell the end for PT, far from it. Sometimes I worry that we were just a training ground, that PT and other companies have learned from us how to be more sophisticated in dealing with and even manipulating communities. At other times, I feel like we managed to do something important in showing that communities should have a voice. I'll end with a quote from David Santillo of the Greenpeace Research Laboratory. It cheers me up when I'm feeling slightly haunted by the endless companies queuing up with unproven geofixes, hyperbolic claims, and big business backers, whilst emissions continue to rise. Here is what David said. On one level, this is, of course, a big win for your campaign and for the Bay and for all the species and ecosystems she supports. It is, however, also a win well beyond that. It sends a message to one of the self-styled leading proponents of marine geoengineering and carbon removals at a global level that they cannot justify their corporate activities on the basis of poor quality science. It shows that people are watching these companies and prepared to put themselves on the line to challenge their proposals on their own technical rationale. And it shows that when you do that, and when those technical grounds are found to be somewhat hollow, then there is nowhere else for their arguments to go. Thank you so much for your time.
And over to me. So hello, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen and then I will begin my presentation. There we go. Okay, so I'd like to introduce to you a seal called Shadow Puppet, who I have photo identified from her unique fur pattern for 25 years. That is our unique selling point at the Seal Research Trust. She is a sentinel individual with a right to life of her own, and she is a sentinel. She is bringing stories, worrying stories, to us on land about the state of our seas. I always like to thank our funders because we are a voluntary organisation, but we have 2 full-time equivalent paid people to support the work that we do. We're a marine conservation charity. We believe in the era of the Ecozoic, which is a time when we suddenly realise we are but one species in a planetary ecosystem upon which we as a species depend. So our work is inevitably all about seals and people. People think I do seals, but actually I have to do people because without people I can't help seals. I have a massive guilt from my generation because we have really screwed up the planet. And now I have a passion to protect it for the next generation who are now picking up the pieces. This is our bay, as Sonara has talked about. There's 3 miles of beaches. It's a human playground and it has been labelled the best beach in the UK. Perhaps you can see why. There is an iconic seascape. This is the lighthouse that inspired Virginia Woolf's book. It's also a place for a key grey seal site in the hub of the Celtic Sea and one of 2 key pupping areas in the southwest of the UK. Any impacts that we have here will be felt across the Celtic Sea and even potentially into the North Sea because that's where our seals are known to move. We do care about climate change big time. We even have a film about climate change on our YouTube channel, and we have this leaflet talking about the impacts that climate change is already having on our globally rare grey seals. So as Sonara has so well outlined, Planetary Technologies project started for us in January 2020. Oh, I forget the year now, 2023. However, that was by March, there were some public events planned. And in the blurb about the public event, there was this statement that said there had been a trial in September 2022 that none of us had heard about, putting these magnesium hydroxide slurry, which they didn't call a slurry, into our ocean to see what the impact would be without looking for the effects. So our reaction initially was that we were alone. I was inactive, stunned and shocked into silence. That was my first reaction. I first heard about the project at a local Cornwall Marine Liaison Group meeting, and I didn't do anything until a lady called Claire Wallerstein, who runs Cornwall Climate Care, contacted me and said, "What are you doing?" And I suddenly admitted that I hadn't done anything because I didn't know what to do. Then there were the public meetings in March, which we sent our vice chairs to because I was running one of our key meetings that particular evening. And then, as Sanara said, we got contacted by the Times newspaper. And what we began to realise when we heard the narrative that was coming from Planetary Technologies is that there were cracks starting to appear. There was a complete lack of background knowledge. They were actually being quite patronising about the knowledge level of our community, to the extent that they actually started offering money to support the charity. I hope that we've learned from plastics. This is a microplastic monster of tiny fibres that was collected from the Cornish Ocean. We have had unintended consequences with our plastics. This is a microplastic monster that I do not exaggerate is the size of a speck of dust, because we wash plastic clothes without a trap and we put this into the sea. Will we learn, was my concern. So we started learning and networking. We decided we'd have to be brave. We'd have to stick our necks out. We would share our experience at all the meetings that we went to. And as Sanara said, people started queuing up to help us. They knew this was a ridiculous idea. And we were contacted by experts and organisations. Volunteer researchers started digging out scientific papers for us. Funders offered us some money in order to spend time, instead of doing our seal conservation, actually working on this project and understanding more about it and the bigger picture. Another shout out to Hands Off Mother Earth, without whom we wouldn't have understood the global picture or the governance structure, or lack of governance structure. Anyway, after all of this, we were no longer the odd seal on the beach. We were in the group. So then we moved to proaction. We started asking questions, writing letters and leading meetings. We found our voice. We were confident enough to ask. We started sharing a major site change that had happened with our seals. We didn't know about the September 2022 release, but 10 weeks after it, our seal haul out changed from one site to another, round a sheltered bay, round the headland, out of the way of the flow of the water that would have been affected by the magnesium hydroxide. We don't know that it was associated with the release, but neither did Planetary know that it wasn't. None of us could be sure. We discovered that others didn't know the answers to the questions we were asking. We asked questions about baselining, what was already there, what did you know about it, community, species, habitat, geology, water quality. They didn't know anything. Modelling, they could only model the amount of carbon dioxide drawdown, they couldn't measure it. And monitoring, they weren't looking in the right place for the right impacts. They would never have seen any impacts. So we started compiling inputs, even did a 3-minute talk at the White House for a community consultation that was being held, and we started requesting meetings with Planetary Technologies, Southwest Water, the Environment Agency, our licensing authority, universities, and we became the early bird catching the worm ahead of the curve. These are the 2 protests that Sanara told you about. They were stupidly well attended. It was fantastic. And I spoke at both of them, trying to give a balanced viewpoint of what was happening and what questions we still need answer. We also mentioned this, which was a Cornwall Carbon Scrutiny Group meeting that we requested from Planetary Technologies to present their baseline survey results to us. This was a pivotal moment. We'd recorded it. We could share the recording with people. And basically, their chief scientific advisor admitted, when asked by Greenpeace about the inadequacy of their baseline, they admitted it wasn't really a baseline and they didn't really have a proper control site. So we've started a baseline thanks to funding from the Flotilla Foundation. We're looking at 4 sites across our bay over 3 years to see what is there. And what is there is gobsmacking. So we're using volunteer divers, we're looking at water chemistry, we're looking at environmental DNA for species analysis, and look how beautiful our underwater habitat is that would have been put at risk as a result of magnesium hydroxide changing the pH levels in our seas. It is absolutely stunning and gobsmacking. The irony here is there's a lobster who's now made a lost lobster pot its home. I like that irony. Sonara also, for Keep Our Sea Chemical Free, produced a documentary about the project, which was fantastic, and it was shown in a public premiere in December 2024. Oh my word, time flies, doesn't it? I don't know which it was now. We've also just heard that planetary technologies will not be coming back. The letter was leaked early by accident and shared by Keep Our Sea Chemical Free, giving us the power in the narrative, as Sonara has said. And they had two flaws in the letter that I received as a result the following day, although a week early. No detectable impact on the local ecosystem. Well, if you don't look for an impact, you don't find an impact. They don't know that that is true because they weren't looking, and they couldn't even spell the name of the town where they were doing it. They added an S to the name of the town. Since then, we've had a Marine Corps workshop with people from international expertise in this matter, looking at how to improve community involvement in the process and also looking at how to make governance more effective for the project. There will be a report coming out from Corps very soon, which will be very useful for everyone. And to sum up, nature-based solutions with biodiversity benefits are much better than geoengineering options. All of us need to take individual actions, turning lights off at home, just to start reducing our carbon footprint. Major companies really need to start working to get to net zero. This is the only way that geoengineering, if it happens, will ever make a difference, is if we get to net zero. We need to empower ourselves to act. We never said no, we just kept asking questions. We think that large-scale closed water trials must happen after laboratory experiments and before open ocean, because if it goes wrong, what happens? When Planetary were asked that, they said it'll be the end of Planetary. And our community said, and what about our bay? So seals, my first love, completely oblivious that their future is in our hands. Will they have a future? Will we have a future? My top tip is to go slow. A 3-year baseline is what everybody desperately needs. We need to constantly ask questions. We need to know what is our motivation for doing this and what legacy are we leaving for children. It's absolutely vital that we do better than we have done so far. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sue and Sonara. And now I'm going to hand it over to Akalok to.
Okay. I'm a little technologically challenged, guys, so bear with me. Okay. Before I get started today with my presentation, I just wanted to take a brief moment to acknowledge that we had a significant loss within our movement and within the IEN family yesterday. Indigenous Environmental Network is not just an environmental organization. We are a family of folks who work together collectively to protect our home and our families and where we come from. And to honor Simone, rather than having a moment of silence, I'm going to ask all of you to take a quick moment and look around to somebody that you don't know within arm's reach. Introduce yourself, your name, where you're from, and your favorite place in the world. Really quick, guys, turn around, look at somebody you don't know, tell them your name, where you're from, and your favorite place in the world.
That's a good idea. Good idea.
Oops. Okay, guys. Okay. give you a quick second to wrap that up. Now we all have new friends in the room, right? This is all about community. And I was a little on the fence about whether or not I would do this presentation today on this panel, because when we lose somebody in our communities, it's tradition for us to not work for 4 days, to grow together and to grieve together, to celebrate together, and to create those memories with that person's spirit with them still. And so I wanted to invite our ancestors into the room and to also allow us to take a moment to grow community, because that's how movements grow. So, kaya kay plusi mga wanga akaluk, ungalak miurunga, angay kang makdak, ano ka apura. Let me see, there we go. Ano ka apura makiraklu anaktiuk asi janililu Charlie. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Akaluk. My English name is Adrienne Blatchford. I'm originally from Unalakleet, Alaska, which is a small village of 700 located on the northwest coast of the Bering Sea, right in the heart of the Norton Sound. Our area is considered the passageway to the Arctic. We have been a trading community since time immemorial. Our community consists of Inupiaq, Yupik, and Dene people, giving our language, our dialect, a trifecta of all three of those dialects and cultural practices immersed into our small community. Today, I want to talk about the fight to save the Arctic and the Arctic sea ice from false solutions. Up here, you'll see photos of Unalakleet right here, right here on the corner. And then myself and my sister and our family, my son, nephew, and my mom right there in the middle, ice fishing. And we've got crab and a traditional feast set out consisting of a lot of our foods that we've harvested ourselves from the land. The Arctic is not just a fragile ecosystem, it is my home. It's the place I am made of. The land, the silt, the water, the sea, the river, all parts of that are parts of me. So why is Arctic sea ice so important? The polar ice cap serves as the cooler for the rest of the world. What happens in the Arctic impacts what happens to the rest of the world, whether they be weather systems or water patterns. They are all impacted by Arctic ice and the Arctic ecosystem. The climate change is induced by industrial colonialism, and it's causing the Arctic to melt 4 times faster than the rest of the world. We're seeing coastal erosion, our rivers eroding, we're seeing sinking lands from methane gas emissions from the permafrost melting, and mercury leaching into our fresh waters, our streams, and our rivers. We're seeing migratory birds, animals, fish, and microorganisms mass die-offs. On our beaches, we've seen animals come from the rest of the world where they should be giving birth and where they should be thriving just like we should in our ecosystem, die. And at first they would say it was unexplainable, but we knew in the Arctic that these animals and these fish and these beings that we have a close relationship with were starving and were fighting for air, and that they were looking for their home. With the magnetic earth changing, their homes are changing. And so we're seeing these animals lost and dying as we are out navigating our lands and our waters through the harvesting season, through the hunting seasons, and through the changes of the moons. And that leads to who is Leslie Fields and what is Arctic Ice Project, formerly known as Ice 9/11, and where and when was this testing conducted, and why was this a bad idea? So in the work that I do, I was born into social justice and ecological justice work. This is something where I come from. You are immersed into that from birth because we fight for our lands and where we live because we have a symbiotic relationship with our ecosystems. We have left little to no carbon footprint in our part of the world. And a lot of these theologies from science and historians have said that we migrated, but our people have said that we've been there from time immemorial, and Western science is catching up to our stories, our oral histories now, and our traditional Indigenous knowledge. And I heard about Leslie Fields in 2018 when I was working at a different nonprofit organization, a grassroots organization. And she was conducting testing up in Utkarvik, formerly known as Barrow. Leslie is I gotta follow my notes here, guys, or else I'm gonna go on a tangent, and I'm really bad at that, and I keep you guys here all day long. So Leslie started her career at Chevron straight out at MIT, and she moved into 3M and began patenting silica-based products. And while teaching at Stanford, she decided that the world needed a quick climate fix and that her petrochemical background could provide. She founded ICE 911 as a Band-Aid for the world's climate crisis caused by the military-industrial complex. And as a Band-Aid, those were her words, right? She said that we needed this techno fix to help the world reduce carbon emissions, not to save the world's climate. So Leslie is doing this work with ICE 911 to create this Band-Aid, and she, with her petrochemical background and her 3M background, sorry guys, I gotta get tissue, I'm a chronic crier. If I hold it in, then I explode. So Leslie is doing this field work up in Alaska, and she's contracted with Urparvik Inupiat Corporation and Ilisarvik College. UIC is a subsidiary of Arctic Slope Regional Corporation. They are not a tribal organization or a tribal government. There's a lot of history behind that, and you guys can follow along at some other point with another one of our works. But Leslie went into this work without informing the people of Alaska what she was doing, specifically people of the North Slope. She made this contract and then just went out and started testing. And when we caught wind of that, we were like, wait a second, what is going to happen here? How are the microorganisms on the ice all the way down to the animals in the water and the mammals in the water that depend on this ecosystem? How is the ice going to be impacted? The winds and the solar system is going to be impacted. How are our people going to be impacted if there are mass amounts of this silica-based dust dumped on our ice in the Arctic, throughout the Arctic? And mind you, she wanted to do this at a so-called small scale, and at this point she was dumping hundreds of tons of this onto the ice up in Utkarvik on a lake, and she called it a controlled area, but it was outside on a lake in the very most northern city in Alaska where the wind never stops blowing. And so we follow her research, and she continues to do this. And so FPIC, Free Prior Informed Consent, is found in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it's made to protect Indigenous peoples, their homelands, and their self-determination and sovereignty. And Leslie conducted these studies on these lands without informing people of Utkarvik and people in the North Slope, other communities, because our wind systems come in through the Japanese wind current. And if you guys pay attention on CNN or Fox News or whatever local outlet gives you the weather, you're going to see once it gets to the global weather systems, they come in through the Japan and up through the Arctic and around, come back down through the rest of the world. And so these wind patterns and everything, how is she going to contain that in a controlled environment outside on a lake in the northernmost city in Alaska, where she's dumping these silica glass beads And when you look at it, it looks like baking powder or powdered sugar when you hold it in the palm of your hand. And when people were skeptical about her dumping this when she would be doing her presentations to new funders or to other institutions where she would tell about her project, she would grab a spoonful of it and eat it, and then talk about how safe it was, and use very climate-friendly words or safe words. This is eco-friendly, and this is going to be great. We're going to help you increase the albedo of the ice, and we're going to thicken the ice by dumping these hundreds of tons of silica glass beads on your ice. And we're going to help you thrive in the Arctic so we could save the rest of the world and the climate. And so we found that Leslie is going to be presenting at the Arctic Assembly, and we went up there and we had confronted her during the Arctic Assembly, and she claimed that they, one, were not testing in Utkarvik outside, and that they were not testing on animals or fish, which at that time they had 4 recorded animals, 2 or organisms or fish species, 2 which are yet to be reported. And so once we called her out on that, she continued to move forward and continue to conduct these small scale testing. And we continued to organize on the ground, and we wanted to figure out, where is she getting all this money from? Where is she able to crowdsource or to fund this? And we found out it's a crowdsourced fund. She's getting it from all of her rich friends in the Bay Area and her golfing buddies and all of these other folks who have money that can afford to donate to this effort as a tax write-off. And so we organized again, and we went down to the Bay Area, and we invited other folks to join us. So we have allies and other Indigenous peoples right here in the photos that you're seeing, where we had attended one of her fundraisers that was held at a golf course at Menlo Park. But prior to the fundraiser, we had tried to purchase tickets online, and we were told that they were sold out, that the event was sold out, and they were so sorry. But the very next day after, we were told that some of our co-conspirators had also purchased tickets and were given tickets online. And so we went down to the Bay Area. We had some infiltrators go into the fundraiser itself that were dressed up as party goers. And then we flocked the parking lot of the golf course, and we put flyers out on everybody's car, and we stood there and we protested. We had folks come out. They threatened to call the cops. We moved to the curb where once the cops did show up, they're like, oh, well, you're protesting. Nothing we can do. Sorry. So we continued through the night, and we were able to talk to some of the funders who were clueless about what was happening, not just in the Bay Area, but what was happening in Alaska and where their money was going and what they were funding. And some of those folks immediately divested and moved on to fund other grassroots movements or other projects that would help combat climate change in a way that would ensure divestment from this petrochemical industry that's enabling false solutions like this. But it didn't stop her. Right? She rebranded. She was like, oh, made a mistake, didn't report all the way, and I didn't do everything I was supposed to do. And I learned that I need free, prior, informed consent. I need consultation, all this other stuff. So she rebrands, she comes back out, and through COVID and through the times our Earth is like trying to slow down, she is testing. And they continue crowdsourcing, and they continue crowdfunding, and we continue to show up. Right? We're organizing and we're pushing back, and folks, not just at an Indigenous Environmental Network, but other folks who are within the grassroots movements and also nonprofit organizations lifted up this movement to push back from this false solution of geoengineering and climate manipulation in an already fragile ecosystem. Right? The Arctic is we see it. I go home every year and something has changed drastically on our lands. Last year, I had gone home and we went to our traditional berry picking spot. And this year I came back and it was a cratered lake and sunken ground, and there was no berries or animals in sight, just a sea of mercury filled water that is leaching out methane gas. And so the Arctic, being so fragile, and people that are Indigenous people in the Arctic rely on this land and the water, the ecosystems. And like I said, that symbiotic relationship has allowed us to thrive in our place because, one, we only take what we need, and we use everything from the animals and the birds and the fish that give themselves to us. Every single part that is usable, we do. And then we return what isn't back to the land and back to the animals to ensure that there's a balance within our ecosystem. And so showing up and protesting and sending letters and doing all of these things held Leslie and her team accountable. And they came to the realization last year, after all of that work, that they were done and that they would close down Arctic Ice Project. And they claimed that the environmental risks, without acknowledging that their project is not only dangerous for the ecosystem, but the actual people who depend on it to thrive in a place where we've always been. There was no mention of people like the Arctic in her work for so long until we called her out. And then her so-called collaboration and free, prior, informed consent was on an industrial level. It had nothing to do with local Indigenous peoples who are on the ground and who live and experience this climate change in a rapid way, so much more than the rest of the world. And her dangerous and reckless field studies are causing further harm to an already fragile ecosystem. And even though Indigenous Environmental Network and our allies and other folks who worked tirelessly to shut down this project, 7 years later, again, she's rebranded. She won't take no for a no, and this climate science fair project that she's got going on, we're just going to continue to show up and to step out and to resist, because our bodies are born on the line. We are the line, and we will hold the line as Indigenous peoples for our right to practice who we are and to be in a place that we have always been. And so we do need divestment from the petrochemical industry and a movement towards an Indigenous-led just transition that ensures a home that's safe for us all, for future generations, 7 generations to come and 7 generations behind us. We learn from what's already happened to move forward, to ensure that our children and those that come after us have a safe place to live, have a thriving place to live, not just to survive. Because right now, what we're all doing is you walk outside and we're surviving 9 to 5, 9 to 5 on this wheel. And the earth would thrive today if each and every one of us were to leave. She would regenerate herself. And we need to focus more on that, on how can we have that symbiotic relationship with the earth and what she provides, and how can we have balance with that. And these are some more of the photos that I wanted to share. I definitely have a different relationship than Sonara and folks in the Seal Collective with seals and Arctic mammals and things from the land in our area. We rely on what the land has to give to us and what we have to give to the land. And that balance is what has allowed us to be in one of the harshest climates in the world, and to be able to be happy and to thrive and to share oral histories from the beginning of time, and to sit around fires at night and share the same embers that have come from the same beaches that our ancestors have walked. And so we will continue to fight and we'll continue to show up. And like I said, it's important for us to have an understanding about how these relationships are, how they work, and how we don't need interventions and false solutions to combat this climate change, how we can do that by focusing on local communities and by uplifting regenerative economies and farming in our local communities, by harvesting, by just being good ancestors and being good people and focusing on what it is at home where we start and then going out into our communities. And if you want to find out more about our work at Indigenous Environmental Network, you can find it at www.ien.org. I'm not going to name all this stuff off. You guys got this. But here it is right here with some of our organizations that we work with and some of the monitoring that happens. Thank you all for being here today and for taking time out of your lives and your homes. Those of you that have traveled away from your families and your communities, safe travels back to wherever it is you're going and in the work that you do. And I hope that the decisions that you make leaving this room will ripple out into future generations, and you'll be remembered as a good ancestor and doing good things. Cleana Devra.
Ben is going to talk to us about the Loch Ness project.
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Benjamin Day. I'm a senior campaigner on the Climate, Energy, and Oceans team at Friends of the Earth. Friends of the Earth is an environmental advocacy organization with over 5 million members across the US. And I'm going to tell you our final story of the afternoon about a controversial experiment called Loch Ness, which was led by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and scheduled to take place this summer. Actually, it just did take place recently this summer. And like the other experiments you're hearing about today, this was a form of marine geoengineering that was pitched as a method for combating climate change. I live on the South Shore of Massachusetts, close to where the experiment was proposed. So I got to really speak with and witness the Indigenous people, fishermen, environmental groups, and even state agencies that fiercely fought back against this project. And yet, despite opposition from all the people who would bear the risks of the experiment, the Environmental Protection Agency in the end decided to issue an ocean dumping permit to allow the experiment to go forward. So I will tell you how that story played out. So Loch Ness stands for Locking Ocean Carbon in the Northeast Shelf and Slope Project. The experiment called for dumping over 17,000 gallons of sodium hydroxide into the ocean in the wake of a ship, just as depicted in the screen here. Sodium hydroxide, better known as lye or caustic soda, in its pure form is the most caustic substance on Earth. Even diluted to a 50-50 mixture like the researchers planned, this substance it would cause chemical burns if it came into contact with human or marine life. And lye is probably most notorious for its criminal use in dissolving bodies. Fun fact, lye can dissolve an entire human body in 3 hours, which is exactly how the Mexican cartels used it. So you can begin to understand why there was widespread concerns about Woods Hole intentionally dumping this substance into New England waters as an experiment. So the Loch Ness experiment was designed to test the concept of ocean alkalinity enhancement, a different deployment, but the same basic premise as the planetary technology example you heard about in St. Ives Bay. Ocean alkalinity enhancement was first developed by Exxon's corporate research laboratories. The idea was that adding alkalinity to ocean water will cause it to draw down more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which if you do it at a very, very large scale, it could help to offset human CO2 emissions that are causing climate change. And the Woods Hole researchers proposed a 2-stage experiment. The first, they would dump 6,600 gallons of sodium hydroxide into the waters just south of Martha's Vineyard, off of Cape Cod. And then in a second larger phase, they dumped 66,000 gallons into the Gulf of Maine. So they applied for a permit from the Environmental Protection Agency and argued that the sodium hydroxide would quickly mix with ocean water, it wouldn't be dangerous for a long period of time, and they would also bring a marine mammal observer to avoid deployment if there was visible whales or turtles or the like. The Loch Ness proposal was met with incredibly widespread opposition, particularly from the communities and industries that would bear the risks of ocean alkalinity and also have the deepest knowledge of these particular waters. The project was opposed by fishermen, lobstermen, by Indigenous people, by local conservation organizations, as well as a huge range of environmental advocacy groups like mine. And even some state agencies expressed deep concerns about the risks and skepticism that the researchers would be able to learn anything really meaningful from the experiment. The New England Fishermen's Stewardship Association, for example, said major impacts to the commercial and recreational fisheries are likely, and they noted the project involved no serious monitoring of impacts to fisheries, particularly the fish larvae that often float near the surface, where the impacts might not be immediately clear. The president of the Seafood Harvesters of America said, "We don't have a lot of appetite for your curiosity for dumping lye into the ocean." And the Massachusetts Lobstermen's Association expressed concerns that the experiment could raise health and safety concerns for their customers buying their lobsters, potentially putting them at a disadvantage. The Wampanoag tribe of Akina on Martha's Vineyard also opposed the project. Bettina Washington, their tribal historic preservation officer, said, quote, "Perhaps our dire concern would be understood better if it can be noted that No Man's Land, which is just south of Martha's Vineyard and the closest to the experiment, was a bombing site for the US Navy during World War II until the early 1980s. We have lived and continue to live with the deterioration of those unexploded ordinances. We do not need or want more toxins in our waters when we can have a say." A huge range of environmental organizations, including Friends of the Earth, raised red flags all over the place. Green Latinos and Earth Justice said that the EPA should not allow any marine geoengineering experiments to move forward unless the EPA first had in place a comprehensive process for evaluating their safety, as well as obtaining prior and informed consent from tribes and Indigenous people. The Center for Biological Diversity argued that the EPA hadn't even proved it has the legal authority to issue permits for marine geoengineering. And I think all environmental groups were concerned that the project was planned in a feeding grounds for the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale, and pointed out that this approach couldn't possibly be scaled up safely to address climate change. Federal law required that the EPA consult with the National Fisheries Agency as well, and that consultation, I think, validated a lot of our concerns. The National Fisheries wrote, quote, "Although the spatial and temporal scale is relatively small, the proposed experiment has the potential to injure or kill all life stages of federally managed species, especially planktonic egg and larval stages that may occur in the action area during the first few minutes after the sodium hydroxide deployment." That's a very technical way of saying anything floating near the surface could be killed in the first few minutes before it's diluted into the ocean. And even state fishery agencies echoed these warnings and added their own. Maine's Department of Marine Resources said that they had significant concerns about the impacts of the experiment on local fisheries, as well as the possibility of stimulating toxic algal blooms. And the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department warned about the impacts on phytoplankton communities and said, quote, "Each of the proposed sampling regions are important to larval stages of many commercially and recreationally important species, including American lobster. Negative impacts on recruitments could be detrimental to the future of these fisheries." So after all of that happened, just 2 days after that National Fisheries letter was published, Woods Hole announced that they were postponing the Loch Ness experiment until 2025 because they claimed they couldn't find a suitable vessel any longer. At the time, given the range and the depth of opposition to the project, we thought that Woods Hole would be abandoning the project, might be abandoning the project altogether. But we were wrong. Just, oops. So they changed, basically a few months after they announced their postponement, they submitted a new revised application to the EPA that abandoned the initial stage that was going to take place near Martha's Vineyard and would instead only dump in the Gulf of Maine. And they were going to dump over 16,000 gallons of sodium hydroxide. So much more than that stage 1 that they had initially planned, but less than that stage 2 that they had planned. And not long after that, despite overwhelming opposition from those who live and work on these waters, In April of this year, the EPA approved the permit anyway. They didn't entirely dismiss community concerns that sodium hydroxide poses a threat to marine life, but they repeatedly claimed that they thought the experiment was small enough that any harms would be local and temporary. And what is deemed an acceptable risk is going to be very different if your entire livelihood and community way of life depends on the protection of these marine ecosystems. And in addition, the EPA refused to take into consideration that ocean alkalinity enhancement would have to be conducted on truly massive global scales if it were to have any impact on the climate. So to us, if your only defense of this experiment is that you think it's small enough that the harms will be contained, what's the point of researching this technique if you're acknowledging it can't be scaled up safely? So I think understanding what alkalinity enhancement would look like at scale is really important. To remove even a single gigaton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is the minimum of what's considered climate relevant, every large cargo ship and tanker in the world would have to devote about 10% of its storage capacity to alkaline liquid, which they would continuously release along trade routes. No one has seriously considered using sodium hydroxide at these scales, not even the Loch Ness researchers. The most common proposal is to use something called slaked lime, which is made from limestone. But to reach 1 gigaton per year of CO2 removals, you'd need to mine 1.6 gigatons of limestone. That's almost the size of the entire global iron industry. And last and most important, the production of slaked limestone generates massive CO2 emissions itself. You'd emit about 1 ton of CO2 into the atmosphere to create enough slaked lime to sequester 1 ton of CO2 from the atmosphere once you dumped it into the ocean. So all the scholarship agrees that if you want alkalinity enhancement to work, you need to use a second carbon dioxide removal technique, carbon capture and storage, to capture those billions of tons of CO2 during the production of slaked lime and find a way to store it all underground. At this point, it should be pretty obvious what a ridiculous idea this is. To put a tiny dent in CO2 emissions, you'd have to build the world's biggest shipping endeavor, one of the largest mining industries, and you are gambling that global scale carbon capture and storage will be possible and safe, which if it was, you might as well just use carbon capture directly in existing industries and cut out the middleman of alkalinity enhancement entirely. So instead of closing with a rant, which I'm also prone to, I thought I would just end with some of the kind of important questions that I came away with from this experience. The first question is, I think, whose knowledge is considered legitimate when evaluating these interventions in the environment? Opposition to this project came from people with a very deep knowledge of these particular marine environments, often intergenerational knowledge, sometimes ancestral knowledge. But the EPA was generally dismissive of their concerns based on a narrow scientific lens. And there are many cases where a narrow scientific lens, I think, is appropriate. But the science of alkalinity enhancement is really in its infancy. No one had even looked at what happens when you dump sodium hydroxide on fish eggs or larvae. So I think that although the scientists involved had no deep knowledge of or connection to the environment they're experimenting with, and it felt to me like they had very little respect for the people who are bearing all the risks or the ways of knowing of the people who have deep connections to that part of the ocean. A second and closely related question to me is that the EPA's process for evaluating projects involves a lot of consultations, but these are consultations the EPA is very happy to ignore or dismiss, and no one was asked for their consent. To me, this raises the question of whether rights should be involved here. In the United States in particular, individuals have pretty extensive rights to protect their property, but collective rights to communal resources are very rarely recognized. So should coastal communities who live in a daily relationship with the sea have a right not just to be heard, but a right to say no when they are bearing all of the risks? A third question is that although there was without question disagreement about the risks involved with the experiment, I think for local communities, even a small chance of serious harm to fisheries and their livelihoods was unacceptable, while the outside scientists tended to treat those same risks as negligible. And that's not a question that can be answered by science, right? It's based on values. So who gets to decide what risks are acceptable and how we weigh those risks against each other? And lastly, for many of us in the opposition, we looked at this experiment with a view towards the potential for scaling up alkalinity enhancement operations. Environmental groups like mine believe that there's no way that ocean alkalinity enhancement could be safely or logistically scaled up. So what is the point of imposing risks on coastal communities if your only argument is that the experiment is small enough that the harms won't be significant? But the EPA, however, wanted to review the project in isolation without taking into account the future prospects of the technology. So thanks for listening to my story from our little town in New England. And Lily, I think, is going to make some closing remarks and talk about the international scene.
Thank you. Thank you for all of those stories. Yes, Lily Fuhr, I work for the Center for International Environmental Law, where I lead our fossil economy program and team, where we focus on, ending fossil fuels, divesting from petrochemicals, and closing all of the escape hatches that the fossil fuel industry and big polluters are finding to avoid the phasing out and the real solutions. And that's where geoengineering comes in for us. And so I just want to close with a little overview of where we are in terms of international governance and regulation. But I really, really want to stress that question of scale, because that is relevant for anything to do with regulation and governance, because we're not talking just small scale experiments. You've given some sense of that scale, Ben, but it's also, just imagine these technologies being deployed at 10 or 20% of our ocean surface globally for hundreds of years. Like, those are the scales we're talking. And the past few decades, especially the past decade, really has seen us growth in experiments. There used to be very, very few. I've been in this work for over 15 years, but just the last couple of years, we've seen an explosion of experiments, and they all have crazy names, as you could maybe tell from some of these, from some of the experiments told about here. And so really, that escalation of this push to put more experiments out into the oceans. So what does governance actually look like? And for that, I think it's really important to distinguish between restrictive and enabling governance, right? There is governance that is meant to give rules to enable something to go forward, and there is governance that is restrictive, right? That is meant to prevent harm from something. So when we look at what we currently have in place, it is not a blank slate. There actually is governance, and most of that is very much on the restrictive side right now. I want to mention particularly two things that are really, really important that we have fought to protect and strengthen in various international spaces. So one is the UN's Convention on Biological Diversity, called the CBD. They already, in the sort of late 1990s, early 2000s, started looking at geoengineering, because they saw a huge threat for global biodiversity coming from these technologies, when most of these technologies were science fiction, basically. And after almost 10 years of deliberations, they issued a global moratorium on all geoengineering. And that global moratorium, which has been decided by consensus, the US is not a party to the CBD, but basically every other country, got reaffirmed several times, including last year, as a result of all of these experiments. So we have a de facto global moratorium on all geoengineering. And they also had a specific decision on marine geoengineering, or ocean fertilization. That moratorium under the Convention on Biological Diversity has like a caveat where it says small scale, purely scientific research studies could go ahead if they happen under controlled settings, but none of what you've heard would fall under that category. So basically what we're seeing is a breach of those international agreements, and a breach of that. So governments are ignoring the moratorium that they've signed on to, including reaffirmed last year in October. And then the other piece of governance that is really important is the so-called London Convention and London Protocol. So that is, a governance framework that regulates pollution and dumping of stuff in marine environments. And that's been emerging in parallel to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And they already effectively and definitely prohibit the deployment of ocean fertilization. So they've been particularly concerned with this one technology that's been sort of the front runner in outdoor experiments already years ago. So they issued a decision that effectively bans ocean fertilization, and also have a framework that allows for purely scientific research. But they have to meet, like research projects that want to go through that have to meet a lot of criteria. And one thing that is not allowed is any commercial aspects. But a lot of the growth and experiments that we're seeing right now, and maybe that hasn't come through strongly enough yet in the presentations, is the push for carbon markets, for selling offsets, right? There's commercial interests behind these projects because people are desperate to buy and to sell carbon offsets to allow business as usual. So we have these two pieces of governance, and the London Convention, London Protocol, they're actually looking at potentially regulating in a similarly restrictive manner additional marine geoengineering technologies at this point. So there are ongoing conversations, some of the ones that Isha talked through at the beginning. So put together, they're actually quite good on paper. And what we're seeing is that we have a problem with implementation and governments actually abiding by the very rules that they've created. And that is really because big polluters are running out of excuses in the fossil fuel industries with their back against the wall, and they're in bed with big tech companies that are expanding their data centers, that are requiring, massive amounts of energy, and to stay within some kind of net zero framing, have to, find a magical solution to offset their emissions. And that's where marine geoengineering comes in right now. So, but this is not really about counting tons of carbon, as you've heard. This is about so much more. It's about defending our oceans against dangerous technologies, and it's about defending fundamental rights and territories and our collective future, and that's why we're in this fight together. Thank you so much.